everybody. This is the Progressive Talk. I'm Slim. I'm here with Kiki, my mentee. We started this podcast to give the audience an opportunity to gain insight into the benefit of mentoring relationships and how the insights discovered through those relationships can shape your world for the better. I'm a lawyer, as I've said before, with an active practice in Texas, and Kiki is a senior high school student here as well. At the beginning of each week, I give Kiki a topic to research for the podcast, and she creates a minority report and reports back what all she discovered. Then we have a spontaneous discussion, hopefully, about issues and solutions to some of the most complex legal and political issues facing the world today. Our hope is that you not only derive the benefit of a vicarious mentorship, but that you stretch your mind and think critically about serious issues affecting our lives every day. We have a few housekeeping matters that we need to take care of before we get started today. We just want to let you know that we are just now starting to learn how to broadcast this podcast. And so just stick with us as we improve the quality of production of the podcast. But for the first few podcasts, it's going to be a little rough. So just hang tight with us as we get to learn how to actually produce these podcasts in a better format. The other thing I wanted to make sure everybody knew is how to get a hold of us. We definitely want to hear your story. We want you to be involved. If you have particular questions that you want us to research or talk about, we'd love to hear from you. And we'd also like to know what benefits you're getting out of listening to the podcast. Kiki, how can they get a hold of us?
Yeah, so it's the Progressive Talk on all platforms, on YouTube, on Spotify, on Google Podcasts, Radio Public, Breaker, and of course Anchor. So that is the way you could reach out to us. And also on social media, we're kind of still getting that set up. But it's on Instagram, it's the Progressive Talk. On Twitter, it's PR and then an O, Progressive Talk. And then we are still working on other social media platforms, but that's what we have so far. But the best way to connect with us is probably our email, which is theprogressivetalks@gmail.com.
Okay, and that's with an S?
Yes, that's with an S, The Progressive Talks.
Okay, gotcha. The other thing that I wanted to draw attention to real quick is last podcast we talked about one of my cases that's pretty egregious that's on appeal right now from a 30-year sentence. It's the Brian Hope case. And our hope is that as we go forward, we can start a coalition and get a petition started to help motivate the judicial branch to either resentence him or release him. He's the kid that stole the vacuum from Walmart and evaded police and got upcharged to an aggravated assault with a deadly weapon on a peace officer. And he got deferred probation for that, for those charges. It was 10-year deferred probation. And then he had, like I said, a drug problem, and he tested positive, I think twice. And the judge came back on a revocation and sentenced him to 30 years. So, needless to say, there's a lot of work to be done with regard to deferred probation. Sometimes people within the system here call deferred probation, a gateway to the system because it induces the defendants to or entices defendants into signing agreements with the state, that probation agreements with the state on the premise that if they do okay throughout the probationary period, they'll get the charges dismissed off the record. And for people that are a little bit more high risk or maybe have co-contaminant issues like drug use. It's a situation where, like in Brian's case, where you make one mistake and you end up spending what could be otherwise up to a life sentence in prison, and that just needs to change. It doesn't make any sense. If it were a situation where they were getting revoked because they committed a new crime, that's one thing. But when you have these kids that are, not committing new crimes, but have clearly a drug issue and need treatment, and instead they're getting 30-year sentences when they don't have a previous criminal record, it's a what I call a manifest miscarriage of justice. The one thing that we want to keep in mind here going forward is that if we get enough people involved in his case, it is possible to push the judiciary to resentence him, even though he had agreed to the terms of the probation, and he knew that it was possible that he could be sentenced to that length and effect. So my hope is that y'all will support us in supporting him, and hopefully we can get some momentum going and potentially change some of the legislation with regards to how offenders that are on deferred probation get sentenced if they get revoked, because the way we're doing it is just not working. So on that, I'm going to give you the quote for the week. A beautiful heart can bring things into your life that all the money in the world couldn't obtain. Notice the beautiful people in your life. And with that, we're going to take a quick break before we get started.
Today's sponsorship is brought to you by Anchor. If you haven't heard about Anchor, it's quite literally the easiest way to make a podcast. Let me explain. First of all, it's free. There's creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. Anchor will then distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many more. And best of all, you can make your money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's literally everything you need in a podcast, all in one place. So if you haven't already, download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started.
So we're back on the record. Kiki, I had you look up what the definition of justice was, and why do you suppose I did that?
Probably because justice is such an abstract concept, because everyone's definition of justice is different. So if you ask me what my definition is, it would probably differ from someone in a different place or a different state or a different race or other social factors that influence what their definition of justice is. It's like a philosophy and a value that's unique to each person. So that's why when in cases, we read about cases, why someone may think that a person of color deserves a stronger punishment than something that's exactly done by a white person, because their definition of justice is different. It differs all across each human being.
And do you think that with a little education, it's possible to equalize that understanding so that there's not discrimination?
I feel like it would take a very long time because it's so abstract and there's so many, you can apply justice to so many different concepts. But I definitely think that if people do start becoming more aware of issues, they will be able to apply justice in the way that's more like a community conscious. So everyone kind of forms the same definition of justice. I feel like that's one of the ways that we could go about having the outcome of a case be the same for each state, or not have more injustices, unfair trials take place.
Okay. And good, Kiki. Mm-hmm. And so what'd you find out when you went to go research what justice was? Was there more than one type?
So I found that there's 4 types of justices. So the first one is restorative justice, which is basically you're giving an alternative to a punishment that has already taken place or is going to take place. So restorative justice is more on the basis of mediation and agreement. It's building the community together rather than taking on the punishment approach. And there's different types of restorative justice. And the one that I looked up, there was, for example, community service is a form of restorative justice, and so is victim offender mediation. So it's kind of like you're restoring what has already been done, but in a more ethical way is how I perceive it. And then there's this distributive justice, which is the equitable distribution of something, which could be money or concepts like social or political power. It could be something like healthcare, food stamps, education, taxation. So when you're distributing something to a group of people, you want to make sure that it's spread in an equitable way, that each person gets what they quote unquote deserve. And that's kind of like the concept of distributive justice, but obviously it goes a little more into depth when you're looking at it from the law angle, the law perspective. And then there's procedural justice, which is the fairness in the procedure of the involving parties or the disputes that are occurring. So this, I kind of see this as the treatment of an individual. So if, for example, we hear about a lot of injustices that happen between police and this set person that they're trying to arrest. So this is kind of talking about how police may deal with an opposing party or a dispute that's occurring, but there's different forms that can block procedural justice, which can be concepts like racism, implicit bias, xenophobia, and all of those additionals all into this tiny topic. And then there's retributive.
No, wait, Kiki. On procedural justice, don't you think that it has to do with preserving the rights, the due process rights of an individual that's within the system?
Definitely. I definitely think it has.
Okay.
People, like, they need to be aware of their constitutional rights that they have. But I think that a lot of the times when you're looking into procedural justice, a lot of the times the individual is unaware of how many rights they actually have. So that's why I think a lot of the times when an individual is convicted of something, they're unaware and they don't really see a pathway of getting justice, because I feel like just the general public doesn't know how much power they actually have in their hands. And that kind of goes in between of pointing out and holding police officers accountable for their actions. So that was procedural justice. And then there's retributive justice, which is punishment that someone deserves, more so kind of like having a punishment that's proportional to their punishment. But obviously there's moral principles that decide this sort of justice, this sort of punishment, because you can't say that, well, actually this occurs in today's society all over the world, but someone who killed someone, they might have a proportional punishment that is the death penalty, that they die as well through lethal injection or whatever. So it's kind of about taking a moral approach, which is why I feel like all forms of these justices, restorative, distributive, procedural, and retributive, is all very controversial, I guess, and it can take place in a lot of different scenarios and involve a lot of different people as well.
Great. And today the main topic that we're going to look at, that I had you look into a little bit, was was the death penalty, right?
Right.
So if you were to pick a type of justice that would justify, if it can be justified, the death penalty, which type of justice would that be?
I think people look at the death penalty through the retributive justice angle, that punishment, that the idea that punishment is something that someone deserves, or it's proportional to the crime that they committed. But I think
it's pretty much an eye for an eye, right?
Yeah,
it's that
definitely.
old biblical theory that, you do this to me, I do that to you.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's retributive, and do you think that that's from a criminal justice standpoint, that's a pretty punishment-oriented system, right?
Definitely. Yeah. 100%. It's so,
Okay.
I feel like it's so flawed. It doesn't look at the possibilities of that individual. Rather, it looks at all of those negatives that are weighing that individual down, making it almost impossible for that person to go back into society as a
Right.
reformed man or woman. It's just,
Okay.
it doesn't have any space for the like remediation / kind of repairing the individual. It's just all about punishment.
Right. And let's take a real quick break, and then we'll talk about the history of the death penalty. So we're back, and Kiki, you're going to tell us a little bit about the history of Texas and the death penalty. What did you find out there?
So I found out that the death penalty in Texas has been a pretty shaky road. And there was a Supreme Court case called Furman v. Georgia that ruled that the death penalty was unconstitutional across all of the United States on the basis that it was cruel, an unusual form of punishment, but also the racial bias that was existing against Black defendants. But after about 2 years, the death penalty was ruled constitutional in Texas on the basis of standard for assessing death sentences. So basically, Texan governors and Texan representatives allowed for a standard to assess the death sentences in the future. So that means that juries were now able to give a sentence of death and death row in Texas once again. So it kind of basically flipped from unconstitutional back to constitutional. And that's why, like, in the United States, each state has its own way of going about the death penalty. That's why some states have it ruled out as unconstitutional, and that's why they don't practice it. But in other states like Texas, it's available. And just a little statistic: between 1980 and 2008, about 52.5% of all homicide offenders were Black. But since 2002, there have been 12 executions of white defendants where the murder victim was Black, but 178 executed defendants who were Black with a white murder victim. So in that statistic, you can clearly see the amount of racial bias and how much race takes into account of the death penalty. That actually leads me to one of my questions. So, like, how have you seen race become something that is such a determinant factor in whether it be a death penalty case or just in general, what in the years that you've practiced?
Well, I'm not from here. I'm from Oregon. So I came down here to try to help fix the criminal justice system one case at a time. I studied criminal justice at Western Oregon University, and a big portion of that study was about, the Texas criminal justice system. I have some published research on it. And in part, that's because it's the worst system in the country. It's the most archaic and barbaric. And the death penalty, the way it's implemented here, is why people that are academics in the field of corrections study it. And it has been plagued with systemic racism since, I think, its invention. And in 2020 or 2021 now, you would think that we would be over some of these things, but certainly that is not the case. And like I spoke about in the last episode, it's even coming to a point where there is some evidence that has come about where people within the system, that are Caucasian, white, and have power in the system are using and planning violence against other minority groups that are not Black or brown, and they're using implicit racial bias to motivate a bad act against that person, whether it's a violation of procedural due process, or in one of my cases, it's an actual violent act, an unprovoked violent act against the person that's disabled. But he's white, but this particular person used implicit racial bias to motivate a police officer to attack this disabled person, and that was in hopes of beating him up so that he would take a plea.
Wow.
And of course, that's sort of the old thuggery that you run into down here that you see every once in a while. And when it's not just blatant and in your face, it shows up even in civil cases. I have one case that went all the way up to the Supreme Court, where my client was African American, and he had an administrative case where they were trying to place him on the employee misconduct list, which would ban him from his profession for the rest of his life across the country. And he there was a procedural due process issue where he got poured out, as well, and in his appeal, and so we took it all the way up to the Supreme Court and won. And the ruling that we got out of that case was, for a due process violation, the remedy is due process, and where that would make sense in states like up north, like New York or California or Oregon or Washington. Generally, in my opinion, and I could be wrong about this, but generally, in my opinion, due process is not something that's either taught here or practiced, and so it gets difficult because you have people that are part of the process, an integral part of the process, that don't know how to cure a due process violation with due process, because they don't know what due process is in the first place. And so it's a fundamentally unfair system down here. And I would like to hope that it gets better, but for now it is unfortunate that the laws just don't apply the same across the board, and minority groups, of all colors, are being affected in a negative way by it. So
yeah, that's very shocking. And also, I feel like it has to do with the people that are in position of power that we elect, because that itself can tell you how much action that they're actually going to take. And just like another statistic, right now there's 204 inmates on death row in Texas. And on average, these people have been on death row for 16 years, but it goes as far as to about 40 plus years of these people on death row. And while 12% of the state's population is Black, 44% of them are on death row. So like you said about that implicit racial bias, it's shown through these statistics. You can see that there's no way you can have such a small amount of people, yet such a vast percentage of those same people committed of these crimes.
Good question. You talked to you had some correspondence with John Cornyn's office. What did he say?
Yes. So I reached out to Senator John Cornyn about the death penalty, And this was kind of during the time of the execution of Brandon Bernard and Dustin Higgs. I wanted to take more like state involved action because obviously Texas is awful with this type of stuff. So he said that the death penalty is a very important part of the criminal justice system. And he said, quote unquote, that we have a fair and effective justice system, the most fair and effective justice system in the world. But he also said that all prisoners should be treated humanely, which was really confusing to me because that is a direct contradiction to the sentence he just said before. He said that the death penalty is important, but then he said prisoners should be treated humanely. Like, it was really confusing. And then as later on, when he was responding to this, he brought up that he introduced the First Step Act of 2018 and how it's based on successful reforms in Texas. It reduced crime, saved taxpayers' dollars. But, I like good job, Senator John Cornyn. Thank you for doing this. But that's not even what I asked about. That's not what my objective was. I was asking about the status of the death penalty and how flawed it is in Texas. And he said also in the email that he was going to work towards reform, strengthen public safety, lower taxpayer costs, give rehabilitated prisoners a second chance to improve their lives. But everything in the email was just so contradictory to me. And I responded back, but I didn't get a response back. But he said that like there's multiple federal and state court reviews that analyze and assess the death penalty and put people on death row, but there's been numerous incidents of wrongfully convicted individuals. Despite these federal and state court reviews, I mean, there was faulty foreign examinations or an extremely biased court based on discrimination or just other uncontrollable factors. And it's just the problem is that the death penalty doesn't punish the worst crimes unimaginable. Because across the United States and even across the world, you can see that a crime that maybe, let's just say someone committed a crime in California, but that person who committed a crime in California could be let off with like 10 years of jail, when in Texas, that person could literally be on death row. It's so abstract, the entire death penalty code that these states go off of. And it's just all imbalanced, and it's not human nature to kill at all. So I guess like that entire email just kind of threw me off and was like, I can't believe that I'm trying to advocate for something that is a big issue in Texas and around the world, but you kind of say like, yes, but, and then just introduce this random act that, like, what am I supposed to do with that information,
Well, God bless John Cornyn. He tried. I mean, he's a little bit of a wordsmith, I'd say, and a little evasive. I'd love to have him under oath and depose him with regard to some of the statements that you're saying he's made, but that's for another day.
Yeah.
One of the things that I think most people don't understand is that the Texas Department of Corrections, and when I say that, I mean, all of TDCJ or JC has been under federal under the supervision of a federal magistrate judge for the last 35 years because there's so much corruption.
Wow.
So, when he's talking about in his letter that there's federal and state review, there most certainly is. That's confirmation that they've been under supervision from the federal government for quite some time because of some of the incredible miscarriages of justice that Texas has done to some innocent people. And I mean, we we statistically kill more innocent people than any other state in the country. We statistically kill more mentally handicapped people or people that have intellectual deficits than any other state in the country. And we will also not allow for people to have the right to appellate review, and, they'll execute them. And it really depends on the type of crime. When you're talking about death penalty cases, in particular, there has been a long history. If you kill an officer, those types of cases, back in the day, they'd just go out and hang you, and take you out back and hang you. It was a little bit of the Wild Wild West, but now, they'll put you on death row, and they'll fast track you, is what it's called, and they'll get that done in about a year and a half. And so it's an interesting conundrum from a defense perspective, because it's very hard to understand or comprehend some of the incredible miscarriages of justice that are occurring, and sometimes you just have to tolerate the misconduct and not participate, but understand that you're within a system that's so corrupt. And when you get to that level of litigation, the stakes are high, and the outcome matters, and in the biggest way. And so I've found that some of the DAs are willing to cut corners, break rules, and just kind of fly by the seat of their pants and hope for the best. And it's unfortunate that there's not more checks and balances. I know when I was in undergrad, I worked as a research assistant under a professor, a neuroscientist his name was Dr. Alexander. And we used to do the CAT scans and the MRI scans on people that were looking at facing the death penalty, in an attempt to mitigate some of the information. If they're found guilty, that information then gets used to either show that they have, a traumatic brain injury or a deficit in some way, or that their brain is just not functioning the same way that a normal person's is, because up in Oregon, you can't execute somebody that has that kind of incapacity. So, so I've been dealing with the death penalty for some time. I've never been an advocate of it. It doesn't make any sense statistically, logically, or otherwise. For decades now, there's been plenty of research that shows that when a state kills somebody, the violence shortly thereafter, violent crime goes up. It doesn't go down. So it's deterrent value as a mechanism for purposes of preventing crime is actually negative. It has a negative effect. It increases crime. It doesn't decrease crime. So its value is little to none. The deterrent value doesn't even, there is no deterrent value. So, it's got an inverse relationship. And so anything that makes that little sense in criminal justice is obviously not worth doing. And also from a philosophical standpoint, it's much harder to do life in prison than it is to do a death penalty, than to be executed. So, if you're talking about you really want to stick it to somebody, an eye for an eye, then you should be an advocate for making them spend the rest of their life in prison, because that is not a fun ride.
Exactly.
So, it just doesn't make sense from top to bottom, and never really has. And people that, believe in it, I think a lot of that old Southern Baptist type attitude. It truly is just, from a biblical sense, an eye for an eye. But then, if you talk to the victims' family members that have to live through that, it's an atrocity. I mean, it is just awful to have to live through something like that. It re-traumatizes the family. It involves them in a process that they, don't even want to be in. It's horrible.
Yeah.
For the collateral damage that takes place. So let's take a break and we'll be right back. Okay, so we're back on the record, and Kiki, you have some more stats for us. What'd you find out about the death penalty and the cost of the death penalty?
Yeah, so in Texas right now, there's 5 scheduled executions for this year, and also Texas executes more prisoners than any state in the United States. There's 254 counties in Texas, but the top 4 counties include Harris County, which is Houston, Dallas County, which is Dallas, Bexar County, which is San Antonio, and Tarrant County, which is Fort Worth. And these 4 counties alone account for nearly 50% of all executions in Texas. And that's crazy. That's a very high number considering, but it make it like considering the population as well for these cities. And then Governor Rick Perry served from 2001 to 2014, and in his time that he served, out of the 570 total people executed thus far in Texas, he had 279 during his time alone, which is,
wow.
Yeah. Let me just do the math real quick, because that's almost a half of that, just 12 less than a half of.
Gee.
I know. And then we have some states that have abandoned the death penalty. There's about 22 states that have done this so far in the United States. There's Delaware, New York, New Jersey. Basically, the entire Northeast has done it. And then a few states around, like Colorado, did it. Just a few days ago, Virginia did abandon the death penalty as well. So that's really great. And then in total in the world, there's a few countries that still have the death penalty, and most of these countries are actually like they're either very, very high standard of living / high income countries with a high GDP and everything, or they're kind of the countries that are a little, still struggling to get. Like, I know in Saudi Arabia, there's a lot of human rights violations that's happening right now. So it's either from like one end of the spectrum all the way to another. So those are the kind of countries that are have adopted the death penalty. And it seems like the middle countries, the ones that are still advancing, but they're not considered a third world country, they don't have the death penalty in them. And then,
and there's some developed countries that don't have the death penalty, like the
right.
UK and Norway and the Netherlands, and a bunch of different countries like that, Denmark, and and those are all pretty advanced.
Right.
A lot of European countries don't have the death penalty. So I think America, at least from an international perspective, this is one of those issues that, this is where we get hung up in treaties and stuff with other countries, is because, certain countries won't extradite if a person is facing the death penalty, because the government just doesn't believe in the death penalty, and they think it's archaic and barbaric and inhumane. And so, you wind up with a situation where if somebody is, is eluding arrest and goes to a country that doesn't support the extradition on the basis that, that we would enforce the death penalty, you're shit out of luck, really, because you're not going to get that person back. They won't agree to extradite them. So, there's a lot of work that needs to be done in that regard. I think from a sophistication standpoint, from a international standpoint, I think if we're going to call ourselves the leader of the world, we really need to operate our criminal justice system from a more sophisticated standpoint that is progressive and teaches other nations how to police and monitor and house offenders, because the offenders are everywhere. They're not just in the United States, but we not only have one of the highest crime rates, we have one of the highest institutionalized population in the world, and then we kill the most people. So what kind of example does that set on the international stage?
Right.
It sets no example. It just shows that we're failing in this part of our democracy. Okay, we're back on the record, and we're talking about the death penalty today, and some of the things that people may not have thought about with respect to that. And one thing that I want to highlight is the collateral damage that occurs anytime really when you have a criminal case, and how that affects the victims' families, but in particular with the death penalty case, because the state will seek the death penalty without necessarily asking the victim what the victim's family wants. They just basically will stand, and some people's families would rather forgive and forget and move on. And I find it somewhat offensive that they at times will rarely take into consideration what that does to the family members, because it forces them into a process, a very protracted process, very long process, years and years and years of being tied to this offender that harmed their family. And then, it also provides this strange opportunity to observe the actual death of the person. And, nothing good comes out of that. It gives the offender the opportunity to say things directly to the victim's family members, which could be offensive or hurtful or harmful or re-traumatize them. And then just the actual observation of the state killing somebody is, you think it's going to be a good feeling, because you're getting justice and an eye for an eye. And then when it occurs, you just, most people if you were to interview people that have watched and observed somebody get executed, say that it is not at all what they thought it was going to be. It was a horrible experience. It was traumatizing and all the rest of it. And then they have to live with that memory for the rest of their lives. So it's like the state sort of puts its own interests ahead of the victims' families and all others in these types of death penalty cases. And in part, it's because, the offenses that they're seeking justice for are usually pretty offensive types of acts that, deserve some form of punishment. But, the collateral damage that happens and the stalling of the intentional stalling of the healing process does nothing beneficial to the family members that are left behind. And I don't think that we think about that enough. It's just the same situation when you have maybe a lesser crime and the person that was arrested or is the defendant has a family or has a child or has a job or has and they're looking at jail time, especially like on a drug offense where there's no real victim. Those types of situations are even more detrimental, I think, to the people left behind, because, if the state comes in and says, come hell or high water, you're doing time. I mean, then, you lose a worker, you lose a father, you lose a support system, you lose all this stuff, and all these people that depend on this one person are then thrown into this, mix of being, unintentionally harmed by the acts of the state. And so, I think going forward, the best thing that Biden could do, or anybody that works on criminal justice reform, is shed some insight and some light on just what sort of collateral damage these people are doing, because the family members and the employers and all the rest of it, all the other people that are affected by sentencing a person to prison, are not being considered right now. Mm-hmm. And they need to be considered. And, the only time in the state of Texas where it's categorically, unequivocally required that you provide a mitigation case is in death penalty cases. And even though there's legislation, or not legislation, but case law at the federal level that says it's malpractice if you don't provide a mitigation case for defendants in any felony case. Texas is notorious for not following the federal laws or the case law. And so, there's very little, I still do my mitigation cases in all of my felony cases, but there's a lot of attorneys that don't. And so, a lot of people are getting huge, big sentences because the factors that I'm talking about are not even brought to the court's attention. So, going forward, that needs to be legislated and required in all cases, not just death penalty cases. And so that, everybody is considered and all of the implications are investigated, and, the judge has all the information so that they can make a better decision about sentencing that is custom fit to the particular offender. Mm-hmm. So that's all I have for today. Kiki, that was a very hard topic. You did a great job.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome. And what do you want to know? What do you want the audience to know that they can do?
Well, I think that one of the best ways to keep having progressive change happen is to just spread awareness as much as you can, but also trying to take action. So reaching out to the officials that are in power, your representatives, the senators, governor, mayor, whoever it may be, voicing your concern and signing petitions and just supporting more grassroots movements and organizations. I feel like that's one of the best ways to create actual change. So yeah, that is my biggest advice.
And how can people get a hold of us?
So it's the Progressive Talk on all platforms, on YouTube, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Radio Public, Breaker, and Anchor. And we're still in the process of getting our social media set up, so I wouldn't really recommend that to be the main way to contact us. But our email is theprogressivetalks with an S @gmail.com. That would be the easiest way to get in contact with us. Once again, that's theprogressivetalks @gmail.com.
And that's all one word, right?
Yeah, that's all one. That's not one word.
Okay. And so in parting, remember, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere.
Right.
And be good, be safe, stay open-minded, and make it count. We'll see you next time, everybody.
Bye, everyone.